This is a Silver Linings Handbook bonus episode. I'm Jayson Blair, and I'm joined in this bonus by Robert Parmer, the host of the Broken System podcast, a true crime podcast that focuses on cases that often get ignored in the media or are handled poorly by law enforcement and others in our system. In this bonus episode from our True Crime Meetup in Minneapolis in early December, we talk with Monte Fronk, a member of the Mille Lacs Band of the Ojibwe, whose 24-year-old daughter, Nada, went missing several times at and after the age of 16, was sex trafficked and rescued in a raid by law enforcement. Nada sadly was killed just as she was beginning to pull her life together in a domestic violence incident with her boyfriend. In this bonus, Robert and I discuss Nada's case with Monte, the broader missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis, and one of our hosts for the meetup called hearing Monte speak one of the most profound experiences of the year for him. A woman who is a Native friend of mine, after listening to an episode I did with Monte in early 2024, said that it was important to have more strong Native men like Monte being voices for the voiceless in this crisis. I couldn't agree with her more. Monte is a strong and powerful man who has an important message. With that, here's our discussion. Okay, so I want to just start by introducing Robert and also introducing Monte. And Monte is the first, I think you're the first Indigenous guest I ever had on my podcast. I had really wanted to explore the topics around Indigenous people, particularly missing and murdered Indigenous women. And through the encouragement of one of my friends, they suggested that I look for people who were articulate on the topic. And I remember after we did our episode, my friend who had suggested it said that she was so glad that Monte was around because she's Indigenous, and she was saying, we need strong men who are advocating in this area. We need role models for other men in the community. And Monte's daughter, he'll talk about this in a little bit. Monte's daughter, Nada, had gone missing several times. I think after she was 16, missing several times, and then eventually was murdered in St. Paul. Oh, Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, just push up. And, Monte is Ojibwe. He's from Mille Lacs Band. His daughter, Nada, was from the Leachy Lake, of the Ojibwe. And one of the best pieces of advice that Monte gave me, because I came down and I interviewed him in January and I came down in August, was to take the time to understand the culture and understand the people and understand the intergenerational trauma that people have experienced. And I've been lucky enough to have a number of Indigenous guests on since on a wide variety of topics, including culture. And one episode that I recommend to everybody out of Alaska, a woman named Kendra Kloster, about some of the advances. The problem of missing and murdered Indigenous people is as old as settlers coming to this country. But we have an opportunity right now to have some positive impact. And I think Monte is a great voice in that area. Robert, I said I wanted to hand this interview off to Robert. I'll still be a part of it. But one of the things that I think is really awesome about Robert as a true crime podcaster, his focus is on the broken system and what's broken in our system. And I think he brings a great voice to these topics. And, for a topic that I care deeply about, I think he is very thoughtful. And I hope that everyone gets lots of good things from this conversation, including what they can do to become advocates themselves. So, Robert, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jayson. So I'm Robert. My podcast is the Broken System Podcast, and I typically work with marginalized individuals and different socioeconomic paths and things like that get kind of overlooked.
Indigenous in my heart. And these stories have been told since the first contact, where we know where our Indigenous relatives were missing and murdered and other things, and were never reported, and it wasn't deemed as worth anybody's time trying to look or find answers for this. And many of our Indigenous relatives, as tribal government employees, and one of the things we were stressing was a second generational. And second generational basically means that the mother of these children, quit using chemicals, typically alcohol, early in their pregnancy. But the damage had already been done. And one of the biggest things that we were taught, and in my daughters, was the fact that they are born with the frontal lobe that has been permanently damaged. And the biggest thing that frontal lobe does is work with impulse control. And the one thing that we were taught is these children will never have impulse control. And they're going to just live a life of just losing impulse and getting into issues with that one and not be able to really stop themselves. And as well as a common behavior too was the fact that how their mind processes things is when they do not follow a rule or something like that, the thing that they'll never do is own their behavior. In their world, everything is somebody else's fault. And when we look at how we even talk or interview kids of this, as public safety officers, we were taught to interview a certain way. My wife, Mino Gizi Ukwe, sitting next to me here, was taught as a CP investigator also. But when you look at these children, you have to reframe how you talk to them, because you can ask them a question. And I saw it in my own daughter, was when you say, why did you do that? You can come back the next day and there's no answer, because the word why is an ocean to them. But that leaves them very vulnerable. And in my daughter's story, we realize that in our household is that her behavior started to escalate. And it was one of those things you never thought as a Native father in tribal public safety that you'd have to restrain your own daughter and use your handcuffs on her to keep her safe and keep our household safe, and have to call 911 to your own house. And all these friends and relatives and neighbors who would always say, hey, we'd love to babysit your kids. If you need help taking care of your kids, we'd be glad to be there. But when they see an ambulance at your house, when they see, tribal response vehicles and city police at your house, and they see your young daughter being taken out, restrained to the stretcher, screaming her head out, bloody murder, handcuffed, everybody just leaves you alone because they just don't know what to do. And so all these people who say they're going to be there for you, they're not. Because when they see, or they saw my daughter being brought out in a stretcher, screaming and hollering on the top of her lungs, you are truly by yourself in this. And everybody says who's going to be there for you isn't there. I was so grateful that the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe provided so much training. But it got to the point in our house where I know no parent wants to look at themselves as not being a good parent or a failure. But we know my daughter's behaviors are escalating to the point where we had to look at out-of-home placement. She was coming at us with knives and things because she had no impulse control. And the thing is, all these children who have the second generation of fetal alcohol syndrome diagnosis, they don't need confined placement for mental health. They're not chemically dependent. And what these children need is just a structured like group home with a little supervision to keep them going in the good direction. But there's nothing out there. And my daughter bounced from place to place to place to place because there was no type of group home or place she could go to that was specifically dealing with these type of behaviors. And she would start to run from them. And sometimes she wouldn't get very far. Sometimes she would. And the first group that really was there for me and as our family was the National Missing and Exploited Children Network, or NITMEC. They are an amazing agency because they are so responsive to us when a child goes missing. And they are non-judgmental. For every time my daughter ran, we had to go out and do a NITMIC poster for her. They never questioned. They were like, we're always there for you. And they always were glad to put those posters out when my daughter ran and, recovered several times from doing that. But one thing I did not realize in these times when my daughter was on run, typically because, again, her impulse control and, in her mind, everything is somebody else's fault. Is I had a cousin of mine who now he passed on to spirit world about a year ago now, who reminded me, he said, cuz you have something no other Indigenous family has. He says, you have a fraternity. I'm like, what do you mean, cuz I have a fraternity? He said, you have fraternity of public safety. Every other Indigenous family, when they call 911, they don't know if that responding agency is going to care or put the time in for an Indigenous or a Native child. They may or may not, but he said, you had a fraternity of public safety responders who are your brothers and sisters that when I needed to put their posters out of the NITMIC, they were always like, and especially because my daughter liked to run to the more urban area of Minneapolis area. Every fire station I asked, every EMS agency, every law enforcement agency were like, hey, we're a family, my brother. We'll put our poster up in our fire apparatus space. We'll put them in our EMS barns. We'll put them up in our squad rooms, because in our world, your daughter is part of our larger family of public safety. And I never really thought about that until my cousin, Don Eubanks, brought that to my attention in a good way. And he said, you just realize how many Indigenous families don't have that. They call 911, whoever comes to that front door, that tribal law enforcement, BIA, city, county, suburban, with that one. We know we are in a crisis in law enforcement where many departments are so understaffed, and especially in Indian country. I know you have heard this many stories of times where all tribal public safety, fire, EMS, law enforcement, emergency management, were all so short. And when Indian country calls 911, those tribal officers who have their passion for their communities are coming to your door. There are 12 cases, they're 12 calls behind. They got assaults going on. They've got, serious crime going on there. And now you're reporting a missing loved one. And where does that fit into their busy call schedule right now? Because they're trying to patrol, thousands of acres with 3 or 4 officers. And that's something we're here constantly. Same in EMS, tribal EMS, and tribal everything else. Is just that lack of staffing is a common thing we're hearing, I guess, not only in the country, but all across.
So Monte, if I could ask you something about that. When I interviewed Kendra Kloster, who is, she was at the time the director of the Alaska Native Women's Center.
Yep.
And we talked about the lack of tribal resources for law enforcement. And, having to also hire people who were not members of the tribes and educate them and focus. And it's really awesome in Alaska when they got this legislation passed, and it's so awesome. The first thing for every law enforcement officer is they need to have appropriate law enforcement training. The second thing is that they have to have training in Indigenous culture. Any law enforcement in the state to be certified. But one of the things she was saying, in addition to cultural awareness, was often you could not find first responders for the tribes who were indigenous themselves. And she said something to me that I didn't even really think much about. She said, we treat petty crimes like capital crimes when it's an indigenous person. And I think you alluded to this at one point where we talked that sort of eliminates their opportunity to go into fields like EMS and other things like that. Are there things that we can do to help recruit more men and women who are like you? Because I think that there is that value. And I know that there are there are African Americans, there are other people who will take the time to learn the culture. But is there a way that we could bring more people who are aware?
And that's a question that goes across all Indian country for the 580 federally recognized tribes, and also because of relocation, our very large urban Native population. And when I'm listening to elders and listening to other tribal webinars, you hear similar stories that I guess path of going into public service. And it's not just law enforcement or tribal public safety. It's going into being social workers. It's going into being therapists. It's going into be child protection workers. We're across Indian country that 1970s, we want to go into these helping professions, these customer service professions, to be there for our own communities, because that historical trauma of those 1950s Cold War policies of the BIA and other agencies where non-Native people were making such decisions for Indian country. And I know my own father, Lee Cook, was one from Minnesota that was known as a Furious 14, who went out to the BIA to try to create change in 1970. And 14 strong Indigenous men went out there who were probably that first generation who got their educations, to went out to the BIA and tried for several years until AIM took over, but could not cut through the bureaucracy. But we're seeing a lot across Indian country where it's just our younger generations are not looking at those helping fields as a career choice they want to make. And then also, like I said, it's youthful indiscretions comes back also, and there's no other easy way to do that. We live in a just, whether you live in an urban area or on tribal lands, some of those times those youthful indiscretions do come back. But I know there are agencies who, realize that, oh yeah, that happened when you were a very young person and you're much mature now and just never had anything else. So why should we keep punishing you for youthful indiscretion? So many tribal organizations are being more flexible and open to realize that, that youthful indiscretions that happened many years ago are not affecting their choices today. And I had a good mentor friend of mine who was a public safety chief of a different department, just really say the same thing. And he's, I make the decisions for who the department hires. And I thought his statement was brilliant to say, I put on my public safety department officers who may not qualify for other departments, but they make the best because they have lived life.
Yeah.
And they said, you know what? When they're dealing with when they're dealing with a customer or somebody who's unsheltered, their life experiences is exactly what that person needs. When they can say, well, you don't know. Oh, yes, I do.
Yeah.
Because they live there and they realize, you know what? It was a youthful indiscretion, but this department realized that it was so many years ago. And they realized that I have learned from that and have grown from that. And I do better serving this community because I've walked, as we say, I walked in their moccasins.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I certainly feel that way in communities I've been in. And I thank you for answering that question. I know I kind of derailed.
Oh, no.
Conversation with that
it was a good question. It was a good question because, it's something we see all across Indian country. Yeah. And it's something that we hear constantly and different, trying to trying to have all of our departments reflect the communities they serve. And sometimes you just cannot find Indigenous people who have the right credentials and degrees to go in there, and unfortunately, and a lot again to the younger people, that sense of serving the community, of being in those helping professions is just not what this generation really wants to do as maybe their parents did.
And until I hand it back to Robert after this, I was going to ask you, for those of us who are outsiders, who are outside of the community, who may want to be of service to the communities, what can we do to be culturally aware, to be helpful, to contribute, to not, and this is one of the things that I want to be clear about, because it's not just contribute to fighting the challenges, because my experience in the last few years in terms of meeting the Ojibwe or the folks in Alaska or the Navajo is I've learned and grown from your cultures in enormous ways, spiritually, literally, factually. But are there things that we can do to stand in the breach to help until the cultures can be built back up?
It's a hard question, because again, when you listen to so many elders who I've listened to and things like that one, and now I've crossed this time in my age of knife of being called a baby or a junior elder now in my own community, is they always say, when you've met one tribe, you've met one tribe.
Yep.
And that is something that there's probably some cultural foundations that goes across Indian country, but you really have to, understand the particular tribe you're working with. Or if you're working in a large urban area like Minneapolis here has a very large urban Native population, and with, probably hundreds of tribal relatives who call this area home. And you think that, okay, you work for a on reservation, that's one tribe.
Right.
But if you choose to work in a large urban Native population, every client you're working with or coming in contact could be a totally different tribal member.
So maybe it is, maybe the key is really just sort of on a more human level to, whether they are Native or otherwise, to just try to understand people and their cultures and take that attitude of openness and not presume.
And you always say, if you don't know, be honest. I don't know. Many, I think, Native Indigenous communities would prefer having somebody who's providing a customer service to them say, listen, I just don't know.
Yep. Then
try to wing it, because we see right through that. Many Indigenous people just see, it's another wave of the same thing.
Yep.
But when somebody comes with a good heart and just says, listen, I don't know, or I'm a non-Indigenous person working for an Indigenous organization, like we see in many all across Indian country. But I think when they just say, I don't know, and I'm going to take the time to basically sit and, lack of a better word, keep my mouth shut and just watch. Yeah. And hopefully there's somebody within that Indigenous organization, whoever they're working for, that will guide me in a good way. Give me some pointers with that one so I can make a step, because many of us in Indian country have heard so many stories of a non-Indigenous person who works for an organization just make a cultural faux pas, say the wrong thing, didn't realize they crossed a line.
Right.
And that's just sets that relationship off back forever, or may never be repaired, because there wasn't somebody in that tribal community willing to give them a little guidance, who say, our community and our urban Native organization, this is how we kind of do things. And so just, we'll mentor you and everything else, because there are so few institutions that provide, that cultural competency type education.
Yep.
I will give a credit that there's so many colleges in Minnesota that do remarkable trainings for working with Indigenous communities with that one. And some of the graduates who we've seen come out with a decent foundation. They're not perfect,
Mhm.
but at least they can come in with some knowledge and be a little more understanding and not just put in a non-Indigenous belief system into an Indigenous community, because that's what this $300 textbook says I got to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So really sort of like coming in with an open heart and open mind and not assuming. Robert?
Do you feel like the non-Indigenous police departments are doing better now with that awareness, or are they still coming in headstrong and kind of kicking in the door saying, here, we're here to help type situation thing?
Again, that's a question that it's all over the table in Indian country. But I will say for Minnesota, they are making such great strides because, our governor in Minnesota always puts out an executive order about proper tribal consultation. And one of the most unique things that he has done is every state agency has to have a tribal liaison now.
Good.
And with Minnesota, we just found out that our former MMIR office executive director will now be our Minnesota Department of Public Safety tribal liaison. So Juliet Rudy is a great choice. Many years experience in law enforcement as a strong Native woman. So we are very fortunate here in Minnesota, where we are seeing, such, proper consultation with that one, and trying to provide as much cultural competency education as we can. So I really credit what this state has done. It is hard to hear when you're at different conferences, the differences. And when I realize that how fortunate we are to be in such a pro, tribal government state because of what our governor has done, and also having a lieutenant governor, it's an amazing working for a state that has the highest ranking Indigenous woman in the U.S. with Lieutenant Governor Penny Flanagan. And there's nothing more humble, even when my daughter was murdered, to get a phone call from the governor's office, and you're going, it's the governor's office, and Peggy Flanagan calls you just to grieve with you. That's an amazing Indigenous woman as she is. She took time out of her day as lieutenant governor to call me and say, I am so sorry what happened to your daughter. And we talked for an hour on the phone.
That's amazing.
And that's just, so a lot of times I am so grateful to see what has been done here. But I still know, again, across Indian country, there are still stories out there. You talk to tribal advocates and there's still stories out there, and there's a list, there's always learning to be done. But I will say for Minnesota, we have done remarkable work here, and we are doing remarkable work. And it's just great to see what they're doing to provide that. Is it perfect? We always have learning. The one thing in public safety, we always say is you need to keep learning, because Minnesota is becoming such a culturally, amazing state with so many different cultures here, that anybody in customer service, I don't care if you're in human services or any type of customer service work, public safety, we are in a very, unique Minnesota state where there's so many different cultures to learn about, not just the Indigenous community.
Do you feel that your role in being a first responder has helped you understand that a little bit better? And also with the situation with your daughter and how that developed, do you think those two things have helped you move that needle in your community?
I think when I hear that question, it's about, in my daughter's story, is that after she was sent to the spirit world, all the advocates who got me through this horrible, dark time in my life, who attended her wake and her funeral, and when they came to me in a good way, and they just said, Monte, when you are ready, because my daughter's Ojibwe name translated means she's a fierce, passionate woman, is my daughter Nada's hope and her wish she wanted to help other Indigenous women who were human trafficked. That was always her goal. Because Akwadizi Nishke Ishkadid Ikwe means she's a fierce, passionate woman, as my daughter's a traditional Ojibwe name. And she couldn't do that. And all these advocates who came in these remarkable, MMIR skirts, supporting this and supporting myself, and just said, be your daughter's passion. Her life was cut too short for her to help others with the passion she had, to help other Indigenous women who were human trafficked. Because my daughter was human trafficked between 14 and 16 years old, and she was murdered at 24. And they just said, because in this epidemic, the people on the front lines of this since first contact has been the grandmothers, the mothers, the aunties, the sisters, and the cousins. But the one who we don't hear from are the fathers. And especially one that is in public safety, like you are after all these years, which says this epidemic can happen to any of us. Because when you look at this epidemic, people always think, oh, it is that Indigenous family, or is that type of Indigenous family, or these are the factors, and you realize it can happen to any Native family, this epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And they just came to me and said, when you are ready, take your daughter's passion to help others and tell her story from a Native father's perspective, because that's who we don't hear from on the front lines. And that has been a gift which I have been honored to tell her story. It's still very hard. But I also know that my time to tell her story is also coming to an end, because it's been almost over 3 years now. And I know when I tell her story, there are other Indigenous families who I have met, and to say, it's your time to tell your story. If I'm given a assignment to tell it, I will probably still do that. But I think in this epidemic, there are others able to tell their stories.
Lifting up other voices.
Right, exactly.
Yes,
Because her journey was there, as my wife always says, that because of what you've done, Jayson, in the podcast, that her life will always be known. And for my role as her father, that was a very powerful thing. The work you have done, the work of other podcasts I've been asked to do, to be able to tell her story, is that her spirit, her story, her life will never be forgotten. And then what the Guardian did also. So it's a gift that is going to be
One of the things that I find powerful and beautiful about her story, she had been trafficked, she had gone missing repeatedly, and it's a tragedy. But at the time she was murdered, she had really begun to rebuild her life. She had gone off to school.
Yeah.
She had graduated. You've told me that story about making it to her graduation.
High school graduation, yep.
Yeah. And I think it's a beautiful thing that you have this opportunity to honor her. And, I know at some point other voices will come up, but she will always have a special place in my heart.
Well, and in her story, if people always ask, well, how did she get human trafficked? And it's one of those things where, as we think about systems that don't always work in our favor for Indigenous families, and I experienced that, because she was at a foster home, and she had run from foster home and actually got on what's called the North Star, and from the St. Cloud area and got to the cities, and she was assigned runaway, and law enforcement was notified, and I knew where she was going, so I called Metro Transit. A friend of mine who worked at Metro Transit. I gave her the description, and this was on a Friday, and she was, 14 years old, and they picked her up, had her in custody, and they called her social worker, a non-native social worker who was doing courtesy case management, and the social worker just basically said, hey, it's 4:20 on Friday, I'm going to go home in 10 minutes here, just take the handcuffs off and let her go.
Mm.
And the transit officer was like, listen, we have her in custody here. She's a signed runaway. You are her social worker. You got to do something for her. And again, she said, well, now it's 4:25. I'm done at 4:30 here. I'll deal with it on Monday, take the handcuffs off her and let her go. And they're like, lady, you are her social worker. You are her case manager. We have her in custody. She is safe. You got to do something for her. And now it's like 4:30 and she says, well, I'm done for the day. Just take handcuffs. I'll deal with it on Monday. And, the officer's like, lady,
because they can't legally keep her.
No. And this is where many of our families' stories revolve all across any country, where agencies have failed our families, especially typically, like, say, off-reservation ones who see, and it's improved, but few of us like myself, when they realize that all they see is a native family. And it doesn't matter that this native family is a tribal public safety officer with over almost 30 years of experience, with a master's degree and many fire EMS certifications. All they see is what's on the outside, and basically it's not worth their time.
Right.
And that's how she got into human trafficking. They let her go. She gave him the finger and walked off. And, and it just was where at that time in Minnesota, we had 2 human trafficking investigators, one in Minneapolis, one in St. Paul. And that's when they started getting hold of me saying, listen, we are, seeing your daughter on adult sex pages, Backpage and other places, and that's when we knew the reality that my daughter at that time was being human trafficked. And this went on for 2 years. They were seeing this, But the big thing was at that time is that the technology wasn't there and the resources that are available were not there for her. They said, we don't know where she's at. We don't have the technology to really know if all this social media is in the local area or was she transported someplace else. And they're using the Backpage or other sex for sale pages to advertise for her, But the one thing they always did say is that as long as we see her being, lack of a better word, advertised, we know she's alive.
Right.
And at 16, that stopped. In the story, it was over a year and we had no contact. They didn't know anything. All the selling the back pages had stopped. And at that time, we also had the Jacob Wetterling Foundation involved in the process. And Patty Wetterling is an amazing advocate. I mean,
she lost her son.
Lost her son. In fact, it was a unique thing. I always tell her, when I started my public safety career in October '89 is when Jacob got taken. And I can remember sitting in, back then it was teletype, and we're getting all the teletype of this young boy from St. Joseph who was taken and missing. And I remember just all Minnesota was being informed and all this. And, and Patty was just an amazing person to always call me to say, how are you holding up? And I finally had to ask her, I said, Patty, when it's been over a year and there's been no word, social media posting, anything. And I just said, what do I need to be prepared for? And Patty, being Patty, is just, she is so honest and caring, but very through her experiences. And she said, Monte, from our experience with the Jacob Wetterling Foundation, think in your mind planning for a funeral, because the chances of recovering your daughter back after this much time is very slim. So as a father, your mind goes from waiting for that call to thinking about traditional Ojibwe funeral, male pallbearers, spiritual fire, feeding everybody, and just that. Then in about a year out, a suburb called Columbia Heights, Minnesota, it was a snow emergency. They were impounding cars, doing inventory, and little did they know they actually found a deceased young woman in the back of a trunk they did from an impound lot. And by her description and age, it really sounded like my daughter. Well, I knew an officer with Columbia Heights Police Department. I gave him a call and I said, hey, my daughter's been missing for over a year and a half. And I heard you had recovered a deceased female body in the trunk of a vehicle. let me send down you her nitpick poster, and I said, if it's her, I will come down and identify the body, and he's like, let me check. And I'll tell you, that is the longest 5 minutes of my life. You're sitting there watching your wash just like taking hours to come back. And he came back and says, well, Monte, it's not your daughter, which was a huge relief. But at the same time, there's another family that's going to be totally devastated getting the word that their daughter, about the same age as my daughter, was found deceased in that trunk in Columbia Heights. And I just thought, I'm still waiting for the horrible call, but this family is going to get the worst call they ever got for that one. And then, as we said in my story, is about a year and a half and there's nothing, and you just live in every Indigenous family I've talked to. We all have walked in the same moccasin path of you're just waiting for the call. Every day you have this boulder on your shoulder of this, is she alive? Is she dead? And you go to work every day on shift and you're just carrying this every day. And it just happened that I get a call from the St. Paul Police Department, and they said, we have a possible sighting of your daughter. A florist shop just happened to, of all things, have her old missing, her nickname poster, and something clicked. And I said, we're going to go check the surveillance camera. Mind you, this is the VHS days, so they weren't too clear and grainy. But they went in, saw it, and they said, but we have an address. And they said, we're going to go check it out. We don't know what we're going to find, but we'll let you know. And they went over to her home, to a house in St. Paul, and I don't know what technique they used, but it was a non-English speaking home, and they showed the poster to this young, and it was a Hispanic type person, the young girl at the front door, and they could tell by the byline something was up.
Yep.
And I don't know what they said, what they did, but they got into the house. Now, being law enforcement, it's about their officer safety. It's about clearing a house safely so everybody goes home safe at the end of the shift. So I'm pretty sure it was felony weapons out. They cleared the first floor safely, didn't find anything. They went down to the basement. There's a large game room in the basement, several other bedrooms. They're clearing that out. And a very young St. Paul officer was walking out and looked behind this big couch in this gaming room and saw a pair of shoes that were standing vertical. And shoes don't do that.
Yeah.
Now, being an officer like we do, all of us who were in this field, is about our safety. And again, it was weapons drawn. They kicked the couch out of the way, and it was what we do. Show me your hands. Show me your hands. They couldn't tell the person was on their stomach, but they got the person cuffed and sat this person up. And to everybody's surprise, it was my daughter.
Wow.
And she was alive. And that is something we rarely hear in Indian country.
Right.
Because we don't hear of our loved ones being rescued. Now, my daughter hated that word. She never thought she had to be rescued.
Right.
Recovered was a little more bearable for her. But when they brought her to the station, typical of any human trafficking person, she didn't say anything. Because that's what they're trained to do.
Mm-hmm.
Their traffickers make them understand that this is what they do. And she wouldn't say anything. And they released her, and we had to find a placement for her. And we actually found a group home in Bemidji, Minnesota, that actually works with young women as they're looking to get closer to being aging out of the system. And it was kind of a group home and mostly it was all Indigenous young girls, and was doing pretty well there. And going to an alternate school in Bemidji, it was just something was eating at her, and she went to the school resource officer, and she just said, I just got to tell you something going on. And as she started telling basically what her human trafficking story was, he realized that he was not qualified to do this. And everything was there in the right place. They had an investigator who was trained at Corner House, one of the best places to go to learn forensic interviewing, especially with women with sexual violence or physical violence. With that one, they have a place there called Hope House, which is for interviewing victims of violence, especially women and families. And it was it was not the typical public safety interrogation room.
Right.
It was a very warm, welcoming type of environment. This officer had the right interview skill and let my daughter talk. And in his mind, he was thinking it'd be like a couple hour. And my daughter talked for 12 hours. She talked 4 hours for the first night and 8 hours the next. And he did the right thing, is that he just let her tell her story till she finished. And, and he got back to me and he's like, yeah, I have like 14 pages of what she interviewed. And being that she was not 18 yet, I got the report. And I tell you, it is no report that any father wants to read of what happened to your daughter sexually, physically, emotionally, to her body, to her mind, to her soul, of in graphic detail. Nothing prepares you for that. And I have read many a public safety report and 911 calls I've been on in my career, but not to read about your own.
Right.
And, but people say, well, how did the human trafficker, control her? And in the report, it said very well that the human trafficker would beat her in her abdomen and in her back area. They never want to damage her face, her breast, or vaginal areas because that's what sells.
Right.
So they would control her by beating her in her abdomen, in her stomach, and her back muscles to comply with whatever the trafficker wanted or needed from her to do. And she didn't finish high school there. And she got to be 18, but she wanted to go back down to the cities where in a previous story, where she ran to several times. But through all the trauma that she had lived through, all these placements, the human trafficking, her Ojibwe name, fierce, passionate woman, was exactly what she was. And she on her own found a technical college that actually helps adults who did not get their high school diploma to go back, and if I remember right, it was 18 to 25, and actually get a high school diploma. And she did this on her own. I couldn't imagine somebody living with this much trauma doing this, but her strength, her passion was not going to defeat her. And she went to this alternate school and completed her high school diploma. And, but before she graduated, she got into a little funk and she said, I don't want you there. And it was kind of heartbreaking. But as her father, I said, well, that's not going to fly. I want to see my Native daughter graduate, because in Indian country, a high school graduation is still a big deal. Yeah. And when you say any Indigenous parent, we're the ones screaming and hollering and whooping up for our high school graduates, because there's still an amazing accomplishment. So I had driven down to the school and I was hoping it'd be in a big auditorium. I could sneak in the back and she wouldn't see me. And sure enough, it was a little bitty classroom. And I couldn't get in there. And I just thought, but I sat in the hallway and I could just see in there. And I got to see, her walk up and get that diploma. And as any Native parent, you get choked up for this, because it's just an emotional moment to see your daughter walk up in her cap and gown and see her do this on her own. And it wasn't like a traditional, this was on her own by her own passion. And I brought a traditional gift for her. I went downstairs, I found her principal and said, listen, I'm her father. I have a traditional gift for her. Can you just give it to her and say I was here? And I left. And I was about halfway up to the Mille Lacs Band where I live over in Chiminasing. And of course, our kids today don't call, they text you. And she just texted me and said, Dad, if I knew you were there, I would have wanted you to see me graduate. And that made me just thrilled. But I have a beautiful picture of her walking up and getting that diploma. And as any Native parent, the guardian, caregiver, it was a very proud moment. And then, as you say, she was doing good on her own. She had a relationship for a while on her own with a good man who weathered her storm with her. She actually found full-time employment and I mean, for her age, have a full-time employment, full benefit. This is on her own.
Nice.
I mean, nothing that I did or her mother did. Her strength, her passion to overcome all the trauma, to find a full-time career. And she was, doing very well until May 21st of 2021, when, unbeknownst to us, the worst day of my life ever happened. And, it was a long shift at work, and I was trying to get home, and we had a house fire in Mille Lacs. And being what I do as a tribal firefighter, I assumed the instant command. I got on scene. Luckily, the house was abandoned. We do what good fire officers do. I walked around, gave the smoke report, got a hold of Garrison Fire Department, gave them all the conditions, fire hydrant locations, assumed instant command until they got on scene. And this fire lasted for 3 to 4 hours until we got everything. Luckily, it was abandoned, nobody hurt, and got everything put out, getting all the hoses back in the apparatus. And all this time, my ex-wife was texting me, call home, call me. I'm like, I don't want to talk to you. I'm on a fire right now. This is important. But then when my daughter texted me, it's about 9:30 at night, and she said, Dad, call home. It's an emergency. And when my other daughter said that to me that's a serious deal. And so I called, and by this time I'm tired. The fire was a long one, but what I heard on the end of that phone is, for all of us in public safety, if we ever have had to be in a situation where we have lost a person on a call, a medical, a fire, for law enforcement, and we are the ones that have to give that death notice. And I have done that several times in my career. And when you do that, you never forget what you hear, what you see of the raw emotions coming from that family member, coming from that spouse, coming from that child, when you have to go to them and tell their loved one, for lack of a word, has died or is dead. And what I heard on the phone was exactly what I have heard in my career: wailing, crying, screaming, hollering, can't talk. And this was Nada's mother. And all I could say is, she's dead, isn't she?
Yeah.
And I got a yes, and I went back, lights and siren, and we had no idea what happened. Nada's mother had a very young officer from our little town, had to tell her the horrible news. And by this time, it's about 10 o'clock, and we have no idea what happened. All we can do is our daughter was dead. And those of us in public safety, we go into what our training mode is. And I'm just thinking now, okay, I got to get people notified. Okay, this is Ojibwe funeral time. So all of those things I had thought in my mind, and I had to get a spiritual leader to start guiding us in this. And so I just knew that my daughter's passion and her strength deserved a spiritual leader of a strong Indigenous Native woman. And for the Mille Lacs band, Babata Boyd was one I just knew was that strength. And I called her and I said what happened. And I told her I'd offer her tobacco or SEMA if she would be my daughter's spiritual advisor for her funeral, which she would definitely honor to do so. Then, I had to call basically a good friend of mine who worked for the Minneapolis Public Safety Department and just say, hey, my daughter's murdered, and I need you to do these things for me. I need to let our public safety family know about this. I need you to organize the pallbearers. I need 6 Native male pallbearers. Luckily, all my fellow emergency managers were available. I said, we have to feed everybody. And, he was like, my brother, I've got you. Just take care of your family. We've got you. Then it was have to wake up all the grandparents. Now it's 11 o'clock at night, almost 11:30 at night. And you have to wake up your parents or my neighbor's grandparents and tell them almost by midnight that their granddaughter is dead. Now, to wake them up out of bed, and some have hearing issues, and to have to call up 3 sets of grandparents and repeat and repeat and repeat that their granddaughter is dead. And they're just like, what? And repeat and repeat. And then they're asking you how. I said, I don't know yet. And finally we get everybody notified that the next day, finally got a hold of Brooklyn Park and got the whole story. And by that time, Channel 9 had a little blip on that. A call came in, a barricaded suspect, shots had been fired at an apartment building in Brooklyn Park. And obviously the person was not willing to come out, and they had to get the SWAT team to go in and breach a window. And when they breached the window into the apartment, what they found was a murder-suicide. And my beautiful daughter, was shot with a modified AR-15 rifle 3 times in the chest, killed instantly. The suspect, a guy I did not know she was seeing. Well, didn't you know who did it? And I said, I did not know this individual who had done this. And obviously, when law enforcement breached, he took the rifle, put it on his chin, and pulled the trigger, and also ended his life. What I didn't know is that one of my good friends, John Cunningham, who at that time was a Brooklyn Park fire chief, and we have known each other for over 28 years, who is now our Minnesota DPS assistant public safety commissioner, was one of the incident commanders that day. And we have a bond now that will be it for us until we both part in the spirit world, because he had heard everything going on. And when he heard and identified who the bodies were, he was just going, whose daughter could this be? By the age description.
Right.
And he's just like, oh my God, it's somebody, and he just tells me when he did an interview later, he said, I couldn't call you my brother. I couldn't call you to tell you that I'm sitting here in the incident command vehicle, and I just heard your daughter was identified as the one who was dead. When the evening of the third day, because our traditional Ojibwe funeral process is a 4-day process. So the evening of the wake, the third night, didn't know who was going to be there. We had a spiritual fire going, and the community center where I lived by was unfortunately being remodeled. And so our district rep called me from, and just was like, I know the community center where you would normally go is under construction, but we want you to have this up at our East Lake Center or the Minnesota, we call it a community, which means, Ojibwe language, the people of the swamp center. And I was so grateful for that district rep, because we know each other for 30 years. And actually it was the right place to have her wake and her funeral, because I brought my girls to, we call ceremonial drummer, big drum, up in that community for many years. And it was the right spiritual place to have her spirit sent on her way. And when I walked in there and saw, my family, friends, relatives, but the most amazing thing was the uniforms. This was on Memorial Day weekend. And to have brothers and sisters in public safety show up in full uniform, it just, right to the heart. It just was a horrible day anyway, but to see the support and the care. And they brought the food like they were asked to do. And they were very so respectful. And once Babata got done with both ceremonies on her wake and her funeral, especially on the wake night. She gets done and sits in front of the entire people attending this, and she's in a beautiful ribbon skirt, and everything is done in a traditional Ojibwe language. But Babata is an amazing, gifted storyteller also. And she sat and told the entire story of why we do the traditional funeral this way, and everything in English. And the one thing that all the responders said, that was the most beautiful story they've ever heard, of how graceful she was telling it and the meaning behind everything. Because when you're sitting there as a non-native responder and you're getting these lessons and putting your tobacco in the fire and not knowing why, because everything's in the Ojibwe language, but at the end hearing this traditional story by this very traditional spiritual person, and she's a gifted storyteller. And then after even the funeral, the one thing that my brothers and sisters in public safety said a lot was the fact that when her spirit is sent to the place of everlasting happiness, our grieving is done.
Right.
Because her spirit is going to a happy place. Her spirit is going to a place where she's going to meet, all her relatives of thousands of years are waiting to welcome her. She's going to a happy place. And we continue to grieve for her. She will want to come back and not want to go there. But one of the memories I do have of that also is my father, Lee Cook, was also, with his age, he was having early onset Alzheimer's kicking in. And his wife, Patty, was able to bring him to the funeral, but he was very scared. He didn't know where he was in the car. And I told our two community members, Renee and Morningstar, I said, my father is out in the car. He has Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's. I said, if he comes in, he's wearing this outfit, can you just gently lead him to where we're sitting at in the front? And eventually he came in. But even in his state, he did get up, and it's one of the best memories I ever have of, he actually went to his granddaughter's casket.
Mhm.
And he spent 20 minutes with her and just stroked her hair and told her how beautiful she was and told her how much he's going to miss her. And it was just a remarkable moment of clarity for my father. And he passed away in that, and later in October of COVID and also Alzheimer's. And so I know they are together now in the spirit world, and that's a very beautiful thing that they found each other up there. And it's one of those beautiful moments that I have.
It's amazing.
And
Thank you.
yeah, and so it's been a journey, but the one thing that so many families who I have met in this epidemic, and it's so strange and it's still hard to hear this, was that when they come up to you and they tell me, as a Native father, how lucky I am. And I'm like, how am I lucky? I buried my beautiful 24-year-old daughter. We are not meant to bury our children.
No.
But they always said, but you know where your daughter is at. So many Indigenous families across Indian country and our urban areas who I have met in this journey have said, we have no idea where our loved one is at. They've been waiting, years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, living with this unbelievable, boulder of their missing loved one.
That
with no
ambiguous
answer.
grief.
But that grief they live it every single day.
Yeah.
They wake up, they go to bed with us every day. And they look at me and say, you're so lucky because you know exactly where your daughter is at, which is true. She's right across from my house. She's missing it in our cemetery. And I go visit her. And that's unique way to live, is that I was able to send her off in a good way, which all these families haven't been able to do. And they want to do. And they want closure and they want answers, and they don't have them. And I do, and it's like, well, didn't you want justice? I said, no, I said it was a murder-suicide.
And there never really is.
No, and there really isn't. I was lucky enough to say it was done deal. There was no investigation that lasted years and years and years.
Right.
It was done.
You knew.
My daughter, unfortunately, was dead. He was dead. But also in the story, I still had to talk to his mother because he had things in her apartment that the lease under my daughter's name and his mother couldn't get. And so I told the investigators I will talk to his mother. And I called his mother up and I said, hey, I'm Monte. I'm Nada's father. And I said, I know you want to come to her apartment and to get your son's belongings, and I think she was so caught off guard that I was calling the father of my daughter who her son had murdered, and she's just like, I said, we both lost our children.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I said, everything of your son's is bagged up. Just come to the apartment and get it. And she was just, well, thank you. I said, it's there when you're ready.
Yep.
And when you hang up from this, you realize that the funerals are so different. When a victim's funeral compared to a perpetrator's funeral. And I know for my daughter, I was able to give her the traditional funeral that an Ojibwe needs to go on their spiritual journey. But his family has to go to a funeral which has a totally different feel because he was not the victim.
Right.
He was a perpetrator of this. So it's just been a journey meeting you and doing these podcasts and bringing the awareness of this to that one. And just from a Native father's perspective, that's just one perspective. But it's been a gift of you and others who have asked that because it's just when you realize the father's perspective is something that's not talked about.
Yep.
Very much in this epidemic.
Yep.
And, it's a burden I have to carry, but it's also, I think, as to keep her spirit, her memory, to help her passion. But again, it's time to put that for myself on the shelf in a good way, to let others tell their story about the ones they've lost.
Yeah. In many ways, right? Your fearless warrior is continuing to tell her story.
Yeah.
Robert, I'm so sorry
You're
for
fine.
pulling a Jayson.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
So as we come to the end of this, and thank you for sharing your story. It's very much yours and her story.
Yeah.
How can we, as non-Indigenous people, help and get involved and make sure that these things are being recognized and treated properly from our side as listeners, as just individuals in your community and other communities? How can we help?
It's really about, like in any path, it's about education. It's about trying to learn. Because when you think about Indigenous people, they don't always look like myself.
Right.
Many of our Indigenous relatives are they look like blonde hair, blue eyed. You wouldn't ever know they're Indigenous, but they're eligible for enrollment of a federally recognized tribe with that one. But it's just like when I talk to my fellow brothers and sisters in fire and EMS. I said, we have a bigger role in this epidemic of missing murdered Indigenous relatives, I think, than law enforcement does, because we have longer contact with our patients. And we're doing a medical call, 911 call, in the back of our ambulances at the long patient contact. If it's a fire situation and we're doing overhaul and salvage and we're doing proper care of those victims of a house fire, we might come across a victim of human trafficking through that one. In tribal emergency management, when we're doing sheltering operations, we might be looking at individuals who are coming in who are being human trafficked, and in our sheltering, we know what to look for. It's always about education. And the good part is, because of what the United States government has done now for improving this, we have so many agencies now on the federal level and the state level that's providing so much education and are willing to teach this or bring this awareness training to many agencies for no cost.
Yep.
And I think that's what's important to understand, to gain some more tools in your toolbox to understand what this epidemic is, especially if you're working in a service-oriented career, in the field, boots on the ground, we call them, working with the unsheltered populations, and this is whether you're close to a reservation or in a large urban native population, it's the same thing. It's just understanding and getting the most information you get out. And with that, is being able to know what to properly say, how to properly talk, and the words to use. So they know that you are asking I always say in a good way, those sensitive questions about human trafficking. And knowing that if you do find one, that you say yes, and this could be male or female,
right?
To know what to do next, to understand which agencies provide services, and to say, I'm going to keep you safe, because I've got training with this now. I know who to contact with that one, and I'm going to keep you safe. And that's something that I am reading more often now, especially in fire and EMS publications of those agencies which are going to medical calls, which are doing this by education, is helping victims who are possibly being human trafficked. And especially in areas with large urban native populations, and also in, close to reservation communities. I just was out in Chicago for a FEMA Tribal Summit, and a good friend of mine is on the Chicago Fire Department in their EMS division, and wants to bring training out there for their Chicago Fire, EMTs and paramedics,
Frontline
because they didn't realize that Chicago has a very large urban native population due to relocation policy back in the 50s, and to give their medics and EMTs some more training. It's just by storytelling. It's something that meeting him, and Jacob has been a good friend of mine now, and I'm honored to be one of his brothers, and by wanting to bring this important topic to his agency, one of the largest professional fire departments in the United States, to give his medical teams more awareness. So if they're out in the field, they can bring that into that also. So my story was just been gifted. We were out in Seattle, and again, we talking with Seattle Fire Department, just again, large urban native population. So it's just storytelling, being a brother in the fire and EMS world, just in my little world, but also having this unique connection of they may hear the word of human trafficking, but have never met somebody who's been affected by it, and especially a brother in the fire, EMS, and emergency management world.
It, very much telling stories and also keeping an open heart.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. I don't know if I ever told the story of how I ended up reaching out to you, but it was very much an open, you'll get this as Ojibwe. Someone made a comment in a text thread that a bunch of us were in about Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And it had been...
This would be a story.
Right. Yeah. And so, and I had made a comment back, and then a friend of mine who's native said, those things kind of bother
Mhm.
because this is what Bigfoot means in our culture.
Mhm.
And separately, she messaged me. She was like, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to embarrass you
Mm.
in front of all these other people. And I said, no, please do.
Yeah.
Just educate it.
Yeah.
A bunch of people. And that began a dialogue
Mhm.
that eventually led me to you. And I'm just glad in that moment my heart was open.
Yeah.
And that led us there. So we're going to wrap up. Raul is going to give a quick presentation on how to look at missing and unidentified cases. We'll take a second to set up.
Yeah.
And then for those of you guys who are here, we're going to have dinner up in the penthouse suite.
Mhm.
Order whatever you guys want if you want to come up to it.
Mhm.
Including you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and again, I really want to thank you again for, our past, our unique where we crossed for several times here, but just your openness to learn and to listen. Because when you look at the populations who you've interviewed in this epidemic, it is so vast and different. And I think you have really come with this with a good heart of saying, yes, when I've met one tribe, I've met one tribal nation, or in the urban areas, and they're willing to sit there and say, I'm going to let them tell their stories, and it's not, it shouldn't be looked at as trying to, to look at pointing fingers. This is about continuing learning and understanding there are so many more resources to this, especially in the federal level, thanks to President Biden, thanks to Secretary Holland on the federal level, and in many states now. The red feather alerts in California, I mean, you're seeing it across Indian country now, where resources I didn't have with my daughter's case. I had NITMIC, which is still amazing, and I had the Jacob Redling Foundation. But what's available now on the federal level and what states are doing to help combat this is so a good story, because of all those strong Indigenous women who stood up and said, no, we want action, and got this action done, got those laws changed, stood up, got alerts done, got training done, got states to have recognized offices, got the right ears listen to it. I mean, strong Indigenous women were the foundation to get change. Yep. They absolutely were. And I will give so much credit, because every time I'm on a conference call, that's what I know is strong. And again, Peggy Flanagan in Minnesota, absolute amazing woman to come, with myself. And when Deb Holland came to the Mille Lacs Band and found me, Secretary of Interior, and found me and just want to talk about my daughter. So that's how much she cared, because she's a strong Indigenous woman and the first Secretary of Interior to be a Native person, which was my father's dream, and and for my role, I'm just a father, but I will always give credit to the strong Indigenous woman. They've been on the forefront since first contact, trying to get change, and they're the keeper of these stories. But again, I look at my story saying there's other Indigenous families who are trying to tell their story about their missing and murdered Indigenous loved one. And my daughter's spirit can rest.
Send them my way.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing how the stories will find you. I always say that. I always say, don't go searching for them. They will find you.
And that has absolutely done.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. Yeah.
I'm Jayson Blair, and this is a Silver Linings Handbook podcast bonus episode. I'll see you all again soon.